I just want to welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. We want to thank everyone joining on both sides of the Atlantic. My name is Jonathan Katz. I am a co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine, TTFU. I want to welcome you to today's TTFU event. I'm also a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's really great to be here today in this interactive session. I want to let everybody know, just to start off, that if you need interpretation, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a sign that you can click on for interpretation. So please use that. And we'll also have a Q&A session as well as part of the discussion. I also, just before we start today, a couple of things. One, I want to thank our lead partner in Kiev, the Reanimation Package Reforms, GMF's Black Sea Trust, and the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. We work with a number of different colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic, including our colleagues at GMF in Brussels, to bring together these types of convenings since 2018. So we're pleased that you can join us today for this conversation that picks up on our theme that we started 2 weeks ago on strengthening Ukraine's resiliency. Today, we're going to focus on Ukrainian efforts to counter disinformation. One of the main tasks of TTFU since 2018 has been to support and strengthen Ukraine's democracy, security, energy and cybersecurity, civil society, independent media, and yes, efforts to combat disinformation. And I think no country, no population has been as heavily targeted by Russia as has the Ukrainian people and Ukraine. And so they've really been faced really the most significant effort that we see globally. Now, we have a distinguished panel of experts in Kiev, including a leading RADA member, as well as my colleague, and I want to thank my colleague, Bret Schafer, who's joining from GMF's Alliance for Securing Democracy. So great to have you with us today. Before I start, I want to just highlight the importance that TTFU places on standing with Ukraine, given the current circumstance, and the importance of transatlantic unity in the face of Russian threats. While there's an effort to de-escalate, we've seen ongoing diplomacy daily at the highest possible level. What we continue to see in the Ukrainian people is extraordinary resolve, resiliency, and also an increasing resolve and resiliency in the transatlantic community, NATO, the EU, the United States, to respond to Russian threats. And that needs to continue. And over the past weeks in Washington, Brussels, and Kiev, and across the transatlantic space, including yesterday, we saw increased levels of diplomacy, including a meeting between Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Biden that was quite significant, that focused on deterrence, transatlantic unity, support for Ukraine. And yes, it did include a focus on Nord Stream 2, which I know is of critical importance to those concerned about Ukraine's security. And this has been important. We've also seen increased levels of military supplies, a number of shipments that we've seen visibly coming in from the United States and other partners that we hope continues and meets the needs so Ukraine can have a defense that they need in this current situation. We also wholeheartedly reject President Putin's assertion yesterday during his meeting with French President Macron that NATO is responsible for the current crisis, or that the onus is on Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement. This is exactly the type of disinformation and spin of Mr. Putin and cronies who are responsible, one, who have 140,000 troops on the border of Ukraine and in Ukraine as well, illegally annexing Crimea, but also responsible for the deaths of over 14,000 people in the Donbass. So I think the onus is on Mr. Putin to de-escalate in terms of troops and to take steps back from the type of aggression that we've seen over the past 8 years. Mr. Putin is the aggressor, and we know that the Kremlin has no interest in de-escalation, given his designs on Ukraine and desire to break the transatlantic alliance and security. So with that said, and I think it was important to reiterate those points, the United States, the EU, and partners need to look at how they can best support Ukraine, not only militarily, but in terms of strengthening Ukraine's resilience. So the conversation we're going to have today is going to touch on efforts to counter disinformation, the importance of independent media in Ukraine, civil society, And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Oreste Chusky, who's a co-chair of TTFU, to focus, to highlight some of the things that he sees happening in terms of the U.S. engagement in this space. Oreste, can I turn it over to you now?
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan. And thanks a lot for your and GMF's leadership, and of course, to our invaluable RPR partners in Kyiv. Our speakers will have a lot of ground to cover, and the focus of the event is more on Ukrainian efforts to fight Russian disinformation, which of course is an integral component of Russia's hybrid war, as some people prefer to call it, multi-dimensional war against Ukraine. But let me just briefly touch upon the US response specifically, or at least certain aspects of it. Despite the criticism of US efforts to counter Russia's disinformation war, and there's no doubt that we can be doing more to build up our own information infrastructure in this respect, I do think the US government has been getting more active and savvier, actually, in shining the spotlight and countering Russia's false narratives. In recent weeks, we've seen some pretty vigorous pushback from the White House and State and Defense Department and across the US government, as well as in Congress, in press briefings and media appearances, statements, remarks, hearings, you name it, especially in calling out Russia as the aggressor, in contrast, of course, to what Russian propaganda would have one believe. Just one example, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki's response to a question at a daily briefing last week, and I want to quote her because I thought this was so effective and so good. She said, when the fox is screaming from the top of the hen house that he's scared of the chickens, which is essentially what they, meaning the Russians, are doing, that fear isn't reported as a statement of fact. Then she says, as you watch President Putin screaming about the fear of Ukraine and the Ukrainians, that should not be reported as a statement of fact. I think, clear, understandable messages such as this one should be disseminated far and wide. Another very significant and welcome step in fighting Moscow's disinformation campaign are the State Department's recently released United with Ukraine and Disarming Disinformation and other fact sheets. And you can find them right on the homepage of State's website. And I think they're a tremendous resource for countering Moscow's, misstatements, half-truths, and outright brazen lies. Another effective tool in calling out Moscow in recent weeks has been the exposure of their planned so-called false flag operations, creating pretexts for an invasion, including most recent plans to prepare a fake graphic video complete with actors and corpses purportedly showing Ukrainians attacking Russians. And it's important to challenge what back during the Cold War were called useful idiots here in the United States who are perpetrating Russian disinformation. They, of course, don't just exist in the United States, but many come from the populist right, as opposed to the more traditional conservatives who tend to be hardline on Russia. But there are also a few on the left. And so far, these pro-Putin cheerleaders are a minority, and their messages, I think, have not had much resonance, and certainly not where it counts, notably, for instance, in Congress. Yeah, there are a few outliers, but the traditional sort of strong bipartisan support against Russia's malign activity remains. And in fact, the debate within Congress is more on how tough the US should be. And we see that playing out right now in the negotiations on the major sanctions legislation. Now, the media coverage has been, I think, incredibly extensive. The quality varies, but most editorials and expert and other commentary, I think, is favorably disposed to Ukraine. And polls, including a Politico journal, one released just yesterday, indicate that American people back President Biden's approach on Ukraine. They stand with Ukraine, and most Americans favor a strong response to Russia's aggression in principle, although, of course, there are differences on what that might entail. So I would argue that, for the most part, Russia's disinformation efforts here in the US, at least, have to date not been very effective. But you can't take anything for granted, and the US needs to build on these recent steps, and we need to amplify our messages to larger audiences, including the Russian people themselves. And of course, assist Ukraine in her war against Russian disinformation. As here too, as in so many other ways, Ukraine is really on the front lines. So with that, I look forward to hearing from our Ukrainian speakers and also from Bret, who's one of the foremost experts in this field. And with that, let me turn it over to Oksana Velychko in Kyiv. Oksana?
Thank you, Orest. Thank you, Jonathan. Dear colleagues, thank you for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to this briefing dedicated to discuss crucial issues Ukraine and transatlantic partners face in terms of countering disinformation. Today we are joined really by our four distinguished speakers. They were partly presented, and this is Yevhenia Kravchuk, Member of Parliament of Ukraine, Deputy Chairman of Verkhovna Rada Committee of Humanitarian and Information Policy. Also, she will be first, and our next speaker is Bret Schafer, Senior Fellow and Head, Information Manipulation Team, Alliance for Securing Democracy. We also have with us Andriy Kulykov, he's a journalist, co-founder of Hromadske Radio, and my friend Vadym Miskyi, Program Director of Detector Media. And I would like to address my first questions to Yevhenia Kravchuk. Yevhenia, thanks for joining us. And how do you, as a member of parliament, evaluate actions conducted by Ukrainian government and international partners to combat disinformation, to strengthen Ukrainians' information security?
Thank you, colleagues. I'm not only member of parliament, but I'm journalist by origin. I studied in Kyiv in Institute of Journalism. And actually, I was part of a Future Leaders Exchange Program, FLEX, and I studied in American school for 1 year. And after that, came back for a few other programs. Thank you for bringing this topic. Actually, we've been together with Vadym and Andriy on many discussions together. Also, at the discussions that were brought by Ukrainian government before taking some steps in fighting disinformation, not by words, but in actually finding ways to have it institutionally. So what I can say about recent 2.5 years that happened after President Zelensky came into his presidency, and we had formed mono-majority in Verkhovna Rada and the government that is now. We really thankful for all the help that was since 2014 and even before, because our Western partners helped creating and backing some NGOs working with fact-finding, fact-checking. But of course, since 2014, it was essential. And it was a great surprise for me because actually Ukrainian state as a state didn't make any state projects on combating disinformation. And all of these projects that worked, they were financed by Western countries and Western governments. So what we did, and I would say that most of the things that were done, or at least started, were done in 2021. We created a few centers combating disinformation. I can speak more about center that was organized by Ministry of Culture and Informational Politics. It's called the Center for Strategic Communication and Informational Security. And my friend and my colleague Igor Solovey is the head of this center, and also he's a former journalist as well. What they do mainly is they put information after we had some Russian attacks, informational attacks, or even they give information in advance. I think one of the previous speakers, I think Otis, said that some of the Western media were publishing the plans of provoking, and this video that was already shot. We had this, I think it was the Center of Strategic Communications in January, and they published a story that probably on this date, Russian-controlled governments in Donetsk could do this provocation, and it was put into many Ukrainian media and also Western media. So I think it's a good example of working with of this center. And I think it's a great project, and I really help it evolve into something very big and that covers a big auditorium. Is media literacy program. We created a filter. It's called Filter. So it's a program. It's also a mini center that is dealing with media literacy. It's backed by programs of IREX, of other countries that finance some sort of programs. And for this year, we have some plans to make the project bigger and to work closely with Ministry of Education, because all these media literacy programs, they need to be inside of the educational programs and probably not as another subject, because schools and pupils are overwhelmed with different subjects, but it needs to be inside of different subjects in different grades. And also we plan to do some media campaigns together with public broadcaster, Steve Vadym as well, and private media about how to recognize fakes and how to do the fact checking and things like this. And I'm sure that this project will be successful only when it covers a huge, big audience. Because even in this Zoom, we're talking with people who know how to do the fact checking, how to see the propaganda, how to check the information. But most of the people, they don't, and they even might think they can check it or can see it's a false information, false news or not. But usually it's much harder than it seems. Also about strategic documents. At the very end of December, President Zelensky signed a strategy on informational security strategy. Right now, a cabinet of ministers is working on a plan of actions on this security strategy. Well, for even those who work with Ukraine for many years, you may be skeptical and say, oh my God, there have been so many strategies, great strategies that were conducted, that were signed by President or whoever. But really, I believe in the plan of actions. And if it's going to be a concrete plan of actions, then it will be successful than the best strategy. Also, I'm part of a working group with not only Minister of Culture and Informational Politics, who is the bigger counterpart on this topic, but also the Ministry of Deoccupation and Reintegration. Because we need to target different audiences. Audience that is in Ukraine, in Ukraine that is controlled by Ukrainian government, and also at the occupied territories of Ukraine in Crimea and part of Donetsk and Luhansk. And also those territories that are close to front line, because we'll probably not take too much time to say that they have problems because Russian TV there and less Ukrainian TV. I mean, it's a long story, but there is another strategy and another working plan that is right now being creating, and I think they the ministry will do the presentation at May. So I really hope that we will do another online meeting maybe in summer, and I could give you more details and actually say that these plans have been signed by government and how we will move forward on these plans. And I'm ready to maybe answer some questions afterwards if you have some, I don't know, questions on the strategy or action plans. And another thing that I wanted to point out is one of the speakers said that it's very important, of course, that Western media play very active role right now in this war, in also informational war. But sometimes, and it's a topic to the discussion, we as Ukrainians are surprised by actions of Western media. For example, I saw that Reuters conducted an interview with Mr. Pushilin, who calls himself as the head of the Donetsk Republic. And but he's a puppet of Putin. He's not a newsmaker. But Reuters journalist, I don't know, he came probably to Donetsk and took an interview. And these steps, they put terrorists to the line of speakers, you know, on this topic. And I understand that, of course, I mean, journalists need to take the interviews, and it's the way how they find the truth. But sometimes by doing this step, you put a person who doesn't have, is not influenced in anything in this war, to be on the same, line. So that's a short notice for me, and of course we can discuss that, but I just wanted to let you know that Ukrainians were greatly surprised by it. But I think that all this pressure that Western media put on this story, it helped as well to gain all this military aid, because Ukrainians, of course, they're so tired of just having statements that we're deeply concerned, and things. We hope that things will change. But when Ukrainians see that Western leader comes to Ukraine, not only with words, but with help, with economic aid, with military aid, it gives confidence to Ukrainians, because it's not a big not uncovering something, because there is a great campaign of Russian propaganda on West, trying to show West as, especially United States, as a country who just wants to divide the world, as it was after at the beginning of the World War II and at the end. That they do not care about Ukrainians. They just want to be, a part of this two poles system, world system. And some of Ukrainians, they can fall into this propaganda, especially after being part of Soviet Union and having propaganda all their life against Western world. That's what we need to understand, that we deal with, speaking about Ukrainian audience. But I would say right now, 2021 and 22 are the years of the most, the highest number of people saying they want to be a part of a European Union, they want to be a part of NATO. That's the highest ratings in all 30 years of independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Yevhenia. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Could it be that, what is your opinion, could it be that President Zelensky underestimates the threat? But very briefly, please, because we are running out of time.
No, of course, it's not that he's underestimating threats, but also he's a president of the country that needs to be operating economically. And he has to understand that all the pensioners will be getting their pensions, the economic works. And for example, today we had a huge DIA summit, which is a summit about how the state becomes in application, in web, you can get all these functioning, I mean, all the use of the state. And also we passed a law for example, IT entrepreneurs to come and to invest into Ukraine. And so we have these, good laws and say, come to Ukraine, invest in Ukraine, and then these investors, they read all these articles on the first page, saying that Ukraine will be invaded in 3 days. So, that's what we mean by President Zelensky saying that, please calm down.
Thanks again, Yevhenia. Thank you. And we are moving further. And now I would like to continue with our next speaker, Bret Schafer. And Bret, what you and ASD are seeing when you track Russian disinformation during this latest crisis, and how it impacts the transatlantic community?
Thanks, Oksana. And, it's interesting. I gave a talk, I think 4 years ago with Jonathan and Ukrainian colleagues. And many of the narratives that we covered then in 2018 are the same narratives we're seeing now. There's some differences. I mean, it's definitely more aggressive. We've seen, as was mentioned, the sort of false flag insinuations that have been put out. But as I kind of walk us through what we picked up on our dashboard, most of these things will not be novel to those who have studied the Ukrainian information space for years, but they've just become sort of more prominent in their messaging. So I'm going to share my screen here. And so all of this data was pulled off of our Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, which tracks all of Ukrainian government messaging and state media messaging across Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and state-sponsored websites. So I broke it down essentially into the sort of primary themes that we have been tracking, particularly over the last 2 months. But again, these go back years. One is that Ukrainians are all neo-Nazis. This is particularly prominent and some outlets that actually target more of the progressive left. So if you see on the left there, this is a show that really targets more of a progressive US audience, sort of amplifying this notion that the CIA is in Ukraine, training Ukrainian Nazis. We've seen this across the sort of Russian intelligence cutout websites. This has been just a particularly prominent theme over the last 2 months because, of course, if you convince Westerners that they are supporting Nazis and not Ukrainian democracy, it's harder for politicians to sell the idea of war or even just providing any support whatsoever. So looking back over the last 3 years, going back to 2019, looking at our data, there's been over 1,300 mentions, official mentions. So these are accounts that are attributable to the Russian government or Russian state media, comparing or at least combining the terms Ukraine and Nazi in the same tweet. What's interesting is this is not just sort of provocations of RT and Sputnik we know to be more provocative. Over 1,000 of those come from diplomatic and government accounts. So these are Russian government officials who are directly making the claim that Ukraine is just a hotbed of neo-Nazis and is essentially being run by a fascist government. So the second main talking point that we have been tracking over these last couple months is that Ukrainian is the aggressor, not Russia. Of course, Putin made the comment that what's happening in Eastern Ukraine looks like genocide, but this has been sort of a consistent talking point coming out of the Kremlin, that Kyiv is the one trying to drag Russia into a war and not vice versa. Of course, sort of accompanying that is that NATO is the aggressor. Again, this is coming from the top. We've seen Kremlin messengers make this statement directly. as you can see on the left there, the sort of idea that Ukraine is just a toy in the hand of NATO, and that Ukraine is a political pawn of the West. The West doesn't care about Ukraine. This conflict is all about NATO aggression. And then again, on the right there, again, this is an outlet targeting American audiences, a Russian state-funded outlet targeting American audiences, where you see this idea that it's actually the US surrounding Russia, that Russian troops are in Russia, sort of putting aside the fact that they are, of course, lining up on Ukraine's border. But this messaging is prominent, again, through outlets and accounts that target both the sort of left and the right of the political spectrum, both in the US and Europe. Just a few more examples of this sort of NATO is the aggressor kind of commentary. Zakharova said that essentially Ukraine sees any military assistance as carte blanche to launch a military operation of its own. So really kind of on the point, aggressive, provocative messaging coming from state media and diplomats. But then there's this idea that Russia doesn't want a war, that Russia is sort of a pacifist in this, that they are unwittingly being dragged into the war by NATO and Ukraine. And so we've seen tweets like this, that Russia doesn't want war, Ukraine doesn't want war, but it's NATO and the rest of the world that are trying to drag the conflict into a hot war. But also this idea that Russians think of the idea of war as being unacceptable, really unbelievable. This again consistently is coming both from the top and from state media. So one thing I did want to highlight in terms of how this is being amplified and perceived in the West, we are about to actually launch an election dashboard in France. So of course, there's French federal elections, presidential elections in April. So we have started tracking all of the Russian state media outlets that target audiences of France, as well as French domestic outlets and French political candidates. What is slightly concerning, and what you're looking at right here, are the top tweets by retweets of mentions of Ukraine from French political actors over the last 2 months. If you sort of scroll through the commentary there, all of them appear to be in sync with Russian talking points. So essentially blaming NATO, blaming Atlanticism. There are several that make, again, this comparison that Ukraine is just this hotbed of neo-Nazis. Now, I should mention that these are not the mainstream political figures in France. These are not really the ones who would challenge Macron, and Macron is certainly not saying this. But when you look at what's getting traction in French social media in terms of what's coming out of French political figures, we're seeing a lot of parroting of Kremlin talking points, and that's obviously concerning. And then so the final I wanted to talk about, this is obviously something that is new over the last couple of months, is this idea that it's really the US and Ukraine that are planning a false flag operation in the east of Ukraine. So of course, Defense Minister Shoigu made that comment in December. But even before that, we saw at least traces of that messaging popping up throughout Kremlin funded, or at least Kremlin cut out, gray area propaganda sites. These are a couple examples. These are from a few of the sites that have been identified by the Department of Justice, by the State Department, as having connections to Russian intelligence. So you see this idea here that it's US military contractors who are preparing for a chemical attack in Ukraine. They try to connect that back, of course, to their disinformation in Syria, that it was the US and others that planned false flag chemical attacks there. And then this quote over here, that Ukraine is preparing an armed provocation in Donbass during the Olympics. That's also been a sort of consistent talking point, that Ukrainian operations with the support of NATO and US are going to be pegged to the Olympics. That's something we have seen consistently. So I think that's important to point this out, because this precedes the US and our allies making statements about the fact that Russia may be planning a false flag operation. So if you look at it through the sort of classic propaganda sense, this is perhaps preparing the ground for what was coming, and just polluting the information space with sort of competing narratives about who would be behind a false flag to really just confuse audiences in the case that Russia actually did launch a false flag operation of its own. But then, of course, when the US pushed back or made the public statements that it would perhaps be Russia planning a false flag operation, those statements were ridiculed. And so you see this idea that the US is the one stoking anti-Russian fears, with these sort of wild and implausible claims of a false flag operation run by Russia. Of course, and this is a consistent talking point, pointing back to US intelligence failures in the past. We've seen a lot of sharing of images of Colin Powell at the Security Council talking about Iraq. And so you have really seen them seize upon US messaging around a possible Russian false flag operation to ridicule it and to say that it's ridiculous, it's implausible, and oh, by the way, the US can't be trusted because of past, quote unquote lies, or at least intelligence that proved not to be accurate over time. So I will stop there. I'm sure there are questions about the effectiveness of the US response. I'll just briefly say, I think the US strategy of getting out ahead of disinformation is the right one. This is definitely a strategic shift in the last 6 months than we've really ever seen from any previous administration, because typically the idea was you would sort of sit on an information campaign, they would treat it as if it were classified, there was limited public messaging about it, and usually there would not be public messaging until that disinformation campaign was released into the wild, and we all know, how difficult it is to debunk something once it starts worming its way through the information environment. So I think it was the right strategy. I think the messaging in this particular instance, and I'm thinking mainly of the idea that they were planning this video, I think the messaging was not good, and it needs to be sharpened from the US side. But we can talk about that more. So I will wrap up now and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bret. Thank you for your observation. But what would be your top 3 advices for Ukraine, for us? What should we do to strengthen our security resilience?
Yeah, in the information space, I think this is across the board. And I know there have been ideas about disinformation fusion centers, both a US one, I think that's been talked about in Ukraine. I would like to see one that's integrated more across allies, so that everyone has a much stronger sense of the information threats people are seeing locally. Because oftentimes it seems we're learning the same lessons over and over again in different parts of the world as sort of interest shifts in what's happening locally. But we tend to see the same players launching the same campaigns over and over again. But we see consistently when something comes out and people in the research community go, we saw this exact same thing 3 years ago, or this site has already been exposed as being a Russian connected site. But we continue to learn these lessons over and over. So if there's a way to combine intelligence, and this is open source intelligence, this is not classified stuff, it's happening on social media, of just saying this site has previously been reported to have connections to Russian intelligence, that would be very helpful, I think. The second is coordination on messaging. This again is not just a Ukraine thing, because Ukraine can't be alone. So in the West, and again, I think made the right call in getting out ahead of disinformation campaigns. There needs to be stronger coordination in exactly what the messaging was. There was a lot of confusion around this video. At first, people thought a video had been made, then it hadn't been made, and then DOD, State Department were on different paths. So I think Ukraine is probably better at this, frankly, than the US is at this point. There needs to be consistency of the messaging when you're debunking something. There can't be ambiguity or competing messaging, because that creates confusion. And I know you asked for 3. Those are my top 2 top of mind. So I don't want to just pull another one.
Could be 2. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bret. And we will move to our next guest, Andriy Kulykov. Andriy, welcome. You are closely working with the media community, and how do you accept media and journalists' reaction to the disinformation threat? How is it effective?
Well, I'm constantly baffled at how little attention we pay to the replacement method. Of course, debunking Russian propaganda and myths is very important, but people will look for even misinterpretation of facts when they are offered in such a technological quality and other aspects of quality as the Russians do this. Back in mid-1990s, we did not ban or did not directly counteract Russian language feature films. We offered a superior quality of Ukrainian voiceover or dubbing. And in time, the Ukrainian quality prevailed, and the audiences shifted their sympathy and their affection to Ukrainian language. in movie theaters. So, besides, we should understand that and realize that in many cases, some Ukrainians simply do not have choice, because there are considerable areas in Ukraine where Ukrainian television or radio is simply unavailable. This pertains to some areas in Odessa region. This is true of many hundreds of kilometers of area next to Belarusian border, where you can easily get Russian or Belarusian radio and television broadcasts, but you cannot get any Ukrainian language or Ukrainian broadcasts in other languages. So I believe that in addition to consistently finding the inventions and myths that we get from the Russian side, we should pay more and more attention to the quality of Ukrainian produce and to the dissemination of it. As for Mr. Zelensky, whose enterprise is still engaged in producing TV series for Russian-speaking market in Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on, well, I don't think that he is fully aware of what his Quartal 95 is doing in this respect. When I try to watch those TV series and some other stuff, I remember friends who are unmistakably American, Eastenders who are unmistakably British, or even more than, even narrower than British. They are East Endish, and neighbors who are, of course, Australian. When you look at the produce of Ukrainian television series, you just cannot place and tie them to any country where this happens. And this helps create the so-called common cultural or information space, where, of course, the Russian myths and propaganda have a more capability of snatching Ukrainians' imagination and attention. So I think that until we put on the market real high-quality Ukrainian product, we may, of course, gain some tactical successes in this fight, but we will never achieve the strategic prevalence. Before this discussion, I read some documents from the NATO and the European Union, and I found them very consistent and very well working potentially in Western societies. And some of them can be spread to Ukraine as well, like governmental support for debunking organizations, like cooperation with local self-government, and so on and so forth. But when accepting or adopting those methods, we should understand the difference in the media environment and the quality of media that we offer. Finally, Andriy Kulykov is a respected colleague at the Internews Ukraine, and yours truly is Andriy Kulykov, who is the co-founder of Hromadske Radio.
Thanks, Andriy. Andriy, can you hear us?
Can I?
Yes?
Yes, I do.
Yes,
I get you loud and clear.
Yes, yes. And Andriy, can you please share your opinion? What would be your suggestions for our international partners in terms of their support of Ukraine's effort to combat disinformation?
When you come to Ukraine, when you look at Ukraine, find out the independent media in this country, and do not only offer them financial or technological help, although you do this, and this is important and useful as well. Offer them your skills, especially skills of working with the audience. And sometimes this may not fall in the eye immediately, but some of the practices that British and American and other media people have are of paramount importance to us. For instance, the Institute of Reader's Editor or Reader's Ombudsman. I do know that this exists in many British newspapers and television and radio outlets. Maybe such a phenomenon also exists in America. Try to persuade people, taking your example as an example, that knowing your audience, not constructing it, but constructing your product to fit the potential interest of the audience is very important. And also tell us how it is possible to grow the taste, to form the taste for quality products in the audience. And so exchange of the skills. And by the way, I do not necessarily agree with the assessment of the scale of Russian propaganda against Ukraine. Maybe by sheer scope and amount, yes, but the intensity, if you compare to what they managed to do in Belarus, then probably Belarus unfortunately takes the first place in being subject to Russian propaganda. And an interesting point there is how they use the Ukrainian example to influence Belarus, telling them, if you want to become a failed state, just look at Ukraine.
Thank you, Andriy. Thank you for your nice advice. I think it will produce many as good journalists as you are. And we are moving. Vadym Miskyi is also with us today. And the last time, Vadym, you joined us, you welcomed the government decision to shut down Medvedchuk's channel, which were accused of disseminating Kremlin's propaganda. Has information space become cleaner since that time? And what is your assessment of ongoing crisis?
Thank you, Oksana, and hello, everybody. I would like to start with the agree of message of Andriy Kulykov that actually Russian propaganda is not that active in Ukraine, and even not that active like it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's reducing now. Russia has almost lost the main means of spreading disinformation. This means was TV channels. First of all, it is about 3 Medvedchuk's TV channels mentioned by Oksana, which were shut down in the beginning of last year. After some time, the colleagues of Medvedchuk bought 2 new satellite TV channels, and in the end of the last year, they also were closed. Also the website Strana.ua, also very pro-Russian oriented as spreading disinformation, also was closed in the middle of the last year. These TV channels and website, according to numerous monitorings, also by our organization, Detector Media, and other monitoring organizations, was constantly disseminated narratives of Russian propaganda. The sanctions applied to them by National Security and Defense Council have been widely supported by the civil society in Ukraine, and we think that these sanctions have proved to be quite effective in restricting the spreading of disinformation. But continuing this practice without a proper legal framework, legislative framework, carries the risk to freedom of expression. So this decision can be potentially questioned in the European Court of Human Rights. That's a risk, and we should work on reducing it, on avoiding it. It should be also noted that sanctions was applied back in 2017 to Russian social networks and services in Ukraine, Vkontakte, Odnoklassniki, Mail.ru, Yandex.ru, and some others. And in 2020, the government extended this ban, these sanctions. So until this moment, all these main Russian social networks are not available in Ukraine and not used that wide as they were used before 2017. Of course, somebody can access them through VPN, but it's a very small amount of people. If we read the new information security strategy recently approved by the president, we see that the restrictive measures will remain a priority for the authorities, and that's why we need to work on a more proper legislative framework. What resources which disseminate disinformation still remain in force? First of all, it's pro-Russian TV channel Nash, which now works, but it wasn't successful in gaining all the audience of Medvedchuk's TV channel. Most of the audience moved to this Nash TV channel, but not all the people. Also, we also shouldn't forget about the constant pro-Russian rhetoric by members of parliament from the opposition Platform for Life party, such as recent Sanctions. We heard from MP Nestor Shufrich to Belarus dictator Lukashenko from our parliamentary rostrum. These messages, they are picked up and replicated by TV channel Nash and and Inter TV channel, which remains one of the top 6 TV channels in Ukraine. It also should be mentioned that online disinformation like Telegram channels is very active in Ukraine now, but still it is not comparable to the influence of on-air TV channels which were closed in the last year. The another point I would like to highlight is recent threats of rollback of democratic reforms in media sphere that began after the Revolution of Dignity. All the media reforms were aimed at the elimination of the state control over media, the denationalization of print press, the transformation of national TV and radio companies, also together with the state, regional state TV channels, into the public broadcasting company with independent editorial policy. However, the government have recently begun up to develop, to build up TV channels that remain outside the public broadcasting system. First of all, it's about intents to spread the broadcast of the Dom TV channel, which was created in 2020 for residents of the occupied territories. They want to spread it to broadcast to entire peaceful territory of Ukraine. Thus, this TV channel, which don't have public control over editorial policy, as a public broadcaster has, can be used to influence the electoral sympathies, political discourse before the upcoming elections in interest of the ruling party. So while we competing with Russian propaganda, there is still a risk to restoring our state-owned propaganda, and this also risk we should work to avoid. Finally, I must emphasize the success of the reform of the public broadcasting and the importance of its continuation and ensuring the appropriate level of funding by the government. Today, the company's editorial policy is completely independent of any political influences that is required by the international standards. And in case of emergency, the public broadcaster is ready to provide reliable information as it's doing now. And unlike other media, for emergency case, it has appropriate capacity to broadcast, including the widest national radio network, Ukrainian radio, which also is most popular information radio in Ukraine. Also, it has national and regional TV channels and digital platforms. So all this capacity should be financed enough and kept ready for any cases we can face. Thank you.
Thank you, Vadym. Thank you very much. You told a lot about that, but maybe to summarize, what would be your top 3, maybe 2 or maybe 1 recommendations for government to improve their efforts and policies in countering disinformation?
Thank you, Oksana. So if summarize top 3, that first of all, I would like to say again that we need to create a proper legal framework, legislative framework for applying for this sanctions mechanism, for applying sanctions against those who spread disinformation, like Medvedchuk's channels. This will help to make sanctions non-questionable, even potentially, for international institutions, and will preserve the decisions from possible rollback in the future. The second point, I would like to repeat the recent call of Media Ruch. It's a community of independent Ukrainian media, journalists and media NGOs. A week ago, they called on the ruling party and president's faction in the parliament to abandon plans to spread the broadcasting of TV channel DOM, state-controlled TV channel DOM, created for specifically for occupied territories, to whole territory, peaceful territory of Ukraine. I think this message is really important in terms of stability of media landscape of Ukraine and in terms of media freedom in Ukraine. And the third recommendation is to continue support of public broadcasting. Do not try to interfere with its editorial policy, and provide stable financing according to the law. That's the main points.
Thank you, Vadym. And thanks all guests for your valuable thoughts. And now I believe we have several questions from our audience. Thus, I would like to turn it back to you, Jonathan, to answer those questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for our speakers. We have about 15 minutes, so I want to try to get to as many questions as we can. And I want to just, Vadym, since you were the last speaker, I sort of responding back to I think that the importance of sort of reforms, of continuing of independent media, of continuing to focus on that is really of importance, both here in Washington and obviously for European partners, but also for Ukrainians that want to see both democracy efforts, but also free media and independent media thrive. And so that's important. And then lastly, just on the sanctions issue, of course, the United States had moved forward and has sanctioned, including members of parliament that, in many respects seem to be a fifth column internally within Ukraine, that are threatening Ukraine's internal security, that are cooperating with the Kremlin. And I couldn't agree with you more on the need to target those individuals in a meaningful way, to expose them. And I think that's particularly important. There's a couple of questions here, and I'm going to start with just a few of them. And I, feel free for our speakers to, if I don't end up calling you, but you want to respond, please let me know. You can just raise your hand too. But one question that we've had, one was from Laura Thornton, who colleague of mine at GMF and directs ASD. She says Ukraine has banned Russian media from its airwaves. I was wondering if there's any evidence that this has been effective at curbing disinformation and or changing public opinion. Has there been research polling conducted both before and after the ban to test its effectiveness, whether it's having an impact? So I'm going to take the Russian media ban from airwaves question. Let me just add a couple of others. Alex Yanevsky with Voice of America asked, how are you going to reach out to the Russian-speaking Ukrainians to help to fight Russian disinformation and propaganda? I'm sure several of you might want to address that question of whether that is part of a strategy of debunking and countering, and if that Russian-speaking Ukrainian community really has the tools it needs to combat disinformation. And then I want to ask a question too, and this is, it's from Dmitro with the National News Agency of Ukraine. It's to Bret. You mentioned Ukraine rather succeeds in debunking misinformation, but those who are inventing fake news could produce thousands of them a minute. So Dmitro has two questions. Should Ukrainian media debunk all of fakes? And if not, how is it possible to choose some of them for debunking? Well, number two, while debunking the fake news, how is it possible to avoid them from becoming more popular because of further spreading in the public media domain? I think those are really great questions. Andriy and Vadym, you may want to answer those as well. But why don't we start first with Laura's question, focused on efforts which has been underway to ban Russian media from its airwaves. And I don't know if maybe who wants to tackle that one first. Okay. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I'll take this one. They are banned from the Sputnik airways, but not from internet. And that's a big problem because Ukrainian users who I used to watch television in Russian, they usually, very often, they switch on internet not for Ukrainian channels that still have Russian programs, but for Russian channels. And that's one of the ideas and probably big questions that we need to discuss in Verkhovna Rada, in the parliament, whether we should ban the OTT platform, Russian OTT platforms. Because actually they're playing dirty. They're giving very, very low rates on their packages. You can buy for $2 a huge package of hundreds of channels. And it's not only news. I mean, it's a TV series with all this hidden propaganda in military, in how they, do it in the TV series. So that's one of the big ideas and big laws. We have media law in the parliament, which is probably for 2 years. It's one of the most difficult laws to pass through the parliament because it also it covers these OTT platforms. So it covers the Russian OTT platforms, and they could be banned. But also it covers other points, for example, internet and internet media. And also when we were discussing, of course, I support public broadcaster, and I'm head of the subcommittee on informational politics, and I'm one of the the biggest advocates for public broadcaster in Ukraine. But we need to be fair that besides Russian propaganda and public broadcaster, the biggest place in the market are owned by oligarchs, by rich people who want to influence politics in Ukraine, and they own these TV channels. And I would really love to see that every year the ratings of public broadcaster are rising so rapidly that it takes a huge place in the market, in the TV market. But our friends in public broadcaster have a lot of years for them to come and to be because I understand that some people say, well, you give so much money, it's almost 2 billion hryvnias for public broadcaster. But if you compare of the budgets of the channels that are owned by oligarchs, of course, it's much, it's much bigger. And if you see how much Russia is spending for the Russia Today and all these propaganda machines, it's 10th time bigger than we can spend officially by giving to the public broadcaster. So we need to have this in mind as well, that we're not only competing for clear news and independent policies of the journalists with Russia, but also competing with oligarchs inside Ukraine. So that's a short mention I wanted to say. And another thing, yes, I agree that also social media is very important as well, but we don't have a solution right now. We have publications of Security Service of Ukraine saying that this list of Telegram channels are linked to Russia or to somehow to occupied territories, and they give the propaganda, but we can't shut these channels. It's only, the only way is to ban the whole Telegram, and I don't think it's a decision, at least it's not on the table right now. But if you have any ideas and how to do it, we're happy to hear.
Thank you for that. And I want to just remind all of our speakers, unfortunately, we have very limited time to get in answers. So if when you respond, try to do a little bit of a rapid response, 30 seconds to answer, questions that require like an answer, a day-long discussion on. So I apologize, we don't have that much time. But I wanted to, Andriy and Vadym, to bring you in quickly, but also then Bret, maybe to quickly answer the question that was raised. And one thing, Yevhenia, that I didn't hear is about Russian-speaking population and about, in Ukraine and how, if that's part of the strategy. But I also take your last point that this media environment in Ukraine is more complex. There's internal competing factors. And I'm sure that Vadym and Andriy, this quite well, but maybe you could just respond. Well, first, let's go to Vadym, and then we'll go to Andriy. And then I did want to get to that question that was posed, and then we'll turn to Bret.
Well, actually, I'll try to be really short about the Russian-speaking population. Because of the law that was passed in 2019, the quota of Russian language in the media is decreasing with almost every year. So it's only some such instruments as Channel Dom that Vadym mentioned could be used more freely to influence Russian-speaking population. But I can say that in this legislation, the level of information from official media will be decreasing in Russia, and there is a chance that these people will not switch to Ukrainian media. They will not change their habits, but they will switch for Russian media produced by Russia, and that is a threat. I guess we have to talk about it, but it's also part of the inner policy in Ukraine, and that's a subject of big criticism in Ukraine in inner policy.
Thank you. Vadym, quickly, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I have to say that I fully support Yevhenia's message about public broadcasting and increasing its value in the society, increasing its audience. Also, I would like to add to answer to Laura's question about recent research on effect of banning the Russian pro-Russian media and Russian media on airwaves. Actually, I haven't seen the research about how it concretely affects on the population, but all the main researchers says that their opinion is that it has a big effect, and we can suggest why we can suggest it, because TV remains as the main channel of information for the people in Ukraine. Still, the most of population, over 60%, receive the information about current events from TV. and then only social networks, radio, print press, and so on. So focusing the government decision of on a TV segment is it's extremely important, because this is the main area where disinformation efforts were made by Russia. The second area is online, and I also agree with Yevhenia that we should pay more attention to it. If we are talking about the Russian-speaking Ukrainians and how we can reach them for debunking, I would like to mention the research of Detector Media made back in 2018. We studied how population on the-occupied territories of Donbass, which were under control of separatists, and then and they came back to the control of Ukrainian government, how they do consume media. Actually, the main interesting finding was that even for those people, Russian-speaking in Donbass, the language of content is not the main factor of choosing. So they will watch TV and they will listen to radio. First of all, if they find something interesting, and second or third or fifth option for them, important thing is language. So even Ukrainian language quality content can completely has full capacity to compete with Russian language content. It's about content quality, not about content language.
Andriy?
I support what Vadym has said, with the exception of the word even. When we say even, we as if maintain that Russian language Ukrainians are very much different from the rest. I do not think they are very much different. Just as the rest of us, they prefer quality. And this is what Vadym said when he said something interesting. This is a component of quality. Yes, we should support the public broadcaster, but I think that they have a few chances to succeed until they stop showing me biblical stories about Moses and whoever else was with Moses, and about pandas and dolphins in far, far away lands. We need, as viewers, the Ukrainian life of today, probably of tomorrow, and of course of the past. And again, about the quality. Yes, Vadym was right when he said that few, or at least not as many as expected, viewers of the pro-Russian channels switched to Russian channels. But there's a very interesting finding that approximately a quarter of them immediately went to pro-Poroshenko channels. And this is, again, because they are used to this quality of product. They just, and this is about replacement. In this case, replacement happened because of necessity. They looked for something familiar. But if we, or no, when we offer them superior quality, I think that our case will be won.
Thank you, Andriy. Bret, bringing you in as well to answer a couple of the questions, but also there was one post in the chat box about your efforts in France, language francophone, how you're tracking that issue as well. And I just wanted to, I know you guys are focused on this upcoming election. If you wanted to just maybe just explain what you're tracking, and if it touches on both francophone and French language as well as English, but also just the questions that were posed. So thank you.
So on the French election project, we are looking at only France, so not the entire francophone world. So we're not looking at sort of Africa's French language outputs. So we are tracking there all of the accounts that we would track on Hamilton. So that's China, Russia, Iran, so state actors. both at the government level and state media level, also French domestic outlets and French politicians. So it's a way of being able to compare and contrast state messaging with domestic messaging and see where the intersection points are happening. That project is actually officially being released tomorrow, I think. So it's not even out yet, but it'll run all the way through the election. On the, the question of what's the best strategy to deal with the fact, and this is a cliche, but it's easier to lie than it is to refute a lie. It takes far more time. So by the time you're refuting one thing, there's 50 other narratives and you can't do it. I think the best strategy is you have to go after the source of the pollution. I mean, this is, again, another cliche, but you don't try to collect all of the pollution that comes out. You try to go after those who are polluting. So you look at trying to expose the sources of disinformation. And so you don't have to refute every single piece of disinformation that come out of those sources, because there's a limited amount. I mean, there's a lot of disinformers out there, but there's less sort of disinforming agents than there are actual disinformation narratives. So exposing them for what they are, exposing how they don't adhere to the best practices in journalism. And then to sort of follow up on some of my colleagues, I think you have to make debunks more interesting. Like, the reason conspiracy theories spread is because they're kind of provocative. They tell an interesting story. It's like, this is compelling media. And so when we are debunking things, we have to look at that from the sort of reverse. How do we make the effort to fight back just as interesting as their effort to spread a conspiracy theory or false narrative? I think a good example of a government doing this was the UK with Skripal. I mean, they were able to release at a certain point all of this video evidence that created this really sort of compelling and interesting story about how these Russian agents went there to try to kill Sergei Skripal, put that all together, and they won the information battle there. I mean, it was so bad at a certain point, even Margarita Simonyan at RT distanced herself from that narrative. And so the final thing that I think was asked was, how do you refute false narratives without amplifying them or giving oxygen to them? And this is something that everybody who deals with information manipulation, including me, struggles with. Like, what is the threshold to respond, or to hope that something sort of dies in the dark, because if you talk about it, you give a little bit more oxygen. So there is no perfect answer here, but I think, again, you pick and choose what to refute. And when you refute it, you provide as much evidence as possible to walk people through how the manipulation happens, so that they have a better understanding of the mechanics of manipulation, so that you're not really talking about each individual narrative. And then there's just best practices. Like, don't repeat the false accusation in the headline. We know most people don't get past the headline, particularly on social media. So when you pose the false narrative as a question, like, did this really happen? And then refute it in the article, a lot of people who are seeing it only see the accusation repeated over again. So, and then the final thing is, I think we just need a better understanding of how people consume media in general and how information gets in front of people. And I'm thinking of algorithms, particularly on search engines like Google, which Russia is really, really savvy at exploiting, and to understand the search terms that are leading people to bad information. We do not do this well at all in the West. When we think of debunking, we put out things from a framework that are not actually what people are searching for. So I'm going to give you a COVID example. Ivermectin, if you search for, is ivermectin safe, the horse deworming pill, you're led to very credible information. If somebody searches for, how do I get ivermectin, they're led to a well of bad information. And so those of us who are debunking and pushing back need to understand the search queries that people who are using that are leading them to bad information, and essentially target those queries themselves, because too often we don't understand really the mechanics of search engines and how people are led to bad information. And the people spreading false information really do understand that. And that's why you see RT say, question more. And you see in the US, do your own research. They know how to lead people towards bad information while giving people the sense that they have agency and they're finding out information on their own. They're doing research. And so again, those pushing back, I think we just need a far better understanding of search queries, how to optimize search engines, And that's where we'll be able to actually get credible information in front of people who are searching out potentially bad information.
Brett, thank you. We're coming close to our sort of end time. We're slightly over, but what I wanted to do is just give each one of you maybe 30 seconds to for final thoughts. And also, I just wanted to, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but one that sort of popped up in a couple of the questions was the issue of that seems to be not as prominent in the media, which is, that there are already Russian troops or security intelligence that are in Crimea and Donbass, already in Ukraine. And I see this as well, even in sort of the West and sort of the US and other media tends to not recognize what is already in place. And so there was a couple of questions about that, particularly because of the concerns that there may be some sort of a limited operation that may have Russia fully move into the Donbass, similar to Crimea. So I want to just maybe, this could be for any one of you to address that, Yevhenia, and maybe it's you as well too, about that, how the government is talking about what already exists. And I agree. I think it's a bit of an area where I find a weakness in sort of both in the West and in how Ukraine describes what's happening, particularly in the Donbass. But let me do this. Let me first start, though, if we can. We're going to go in reverse order. Give 30 seconds, Vadym, just sort of your closing thoughts. And then we'll sort of go to Andriy after that. And then Bret, and then we'll sort of finish up and sort of Yevhenia with you as well. So Vadym, final thoughts?
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I believe that effective, efficient countering disinformation, it's about uniting of a force from the government side and from the side of civil society and media. We see that there are a lot of efforts from all of these parties, but still we need ensure high level, more cooperation, more high level cooperation to be sure that we have proper legislation base for countering disinformation, that our efforts in media sphere and especially for now in online media are coordinated and we understand what we do and what effect we want to reach. And also it is important while we're fighting with Russian disinformation not to build up our own propaganda resources inside the country, but to develop the public broadcasting system and support other independent media in Ukraine as well to create and move forward to better media landscape.
Thank you. Andriy?
First of all, thank you, Bret, for workable advice. Thank you, organizers, for doing this meeting. To Bret's advice, I would also add something like, do not refute by saying this cannot happen because this cannot happen ever. And sometimes we Ukrainians do this. Another thing which is probably addressed to the Ukrainian government is, if you cry wolf too many times, then of course we all know what happens. When the wolf is there, no one's going to believe you. And of course, these are not my final thoughts, because I will be thinking about this tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and unfortunately for many, many years to come.
Thank you. Bret?
I'll try to end on a slightly optimistic note, and I think that is that we are looking just at disinformation in a much better place in 2022 than we were in 2014 across the world. I think in 2014 I was in grad school and I was starting to work on sort of historical review of Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation, when it was a pretty novel concept. There was very little content out there. Even the concept of disinformation was not well understood, particularly in the US. And so we were very flat-footed when Russia launched many disinformation campaigns around the initial incursions into Ukraine. Then I think we're societally, both in the West, but globally, just in a much better position to respond now because we know the game. We have institutions like ours and others that have been set up to respond to disinfo campaigns. So the one positive is this time around, we're not going to be caught by the element of surprise because I think we're prepared this time.
That's important, a really important point, and I think when we turn, Yevhenia, when we turn to you too on this, because you're, I think what Vadym and Andriy have said too about obviously this interconnection between civil society, independent media, government, the ecosystem. The one that Bret has talked about that's been built up over the last couple of years, you've talked about as well in terms of the struggles. Maybe just your final thoughts too, because I think they've done an excellent job at linking all these different pieces together, both the context, strategy, needs, and just so we could turn to you for final thoughts.
Yes, I think that we did some good job with fighting the instruments that Russia uses as propaganda. That's what we talked about, sanctioning pro-Russian media and finding the way how to stop them in Ukrainian territory. But I hope that we will all also concentrate on creating Ukrainian narratives. Because why this glass is being filled by muddy water of Russian propaganda? Because it's not filled enough with information, clear information from Ukrainian government as well. Because I see this as a journalist in my past, that you need to be proactive. You need to give your narratives as fast as possible and as accurate as possible. And then it will be, on the same scale, fighting disinformation and giving your own narratives. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're gonna, really appreciate all of our speakers too, at an incredibly busy time. You're all in this space fighting against disinformation, trying to present, I think, perspectives of what's both taking place. It was incredibly important to hear from all of you, including those that are participating today from both Washington and Europe, to understand what the context of the challenges that Ukraine faces. Disinformation is one that there isn't a government in the transatlantic community, whether they're members of NATO or the EU, partners of, that are not dealing with this specific issue. So we all have a lot to learn from each other. I think and maybe it was Bret who said, one of you said having a stronger transatlantic component to this so that we're sharing best practices, content, response to. I think that was really smart. And I urge those colleagues from governments that are joining today to really think through this more strongly. I want to thank Oksana for excellent moderation. Thank you so much. Orest, our speakers, the Transatlantic Task Force was meant to have this type of conversation that we're having today. We look forward to, and we will continue to focus on standing with Ukraine during this period, but also support for resilience. This is one area that clearly needs continued focus. Bret, we're in a better place than we were in 2014. That's true. I hope we're better a month, 2 months from now together in addressing these issues, and hearing from the experts that we heard from today is so incredibly valuable. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to RPR, German Marshall Fund of the United States, and other partners. And I want to wish everybody a good rest of their day. And hopefully we can have all of you back again sometime in the future speaking to this issue. And hopefully we'll be speaking at a better moment where we're able to move beyond the current crisis. But our thoughts right now are with Ukraine and those leaders that are having to deal with this challenge, and civil society and others who are standing with the Ukrainian government. So thank you to everybody. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.